NAGPRA is a human rights statute.
It is a process.
It's a tool.
Level playing field and bring the ancestors back home.
It's about relationships.
NAGPRA is civil rights legislation.
NAGPRA itself outlines the expectation of tribes and museums.
A reconciliation.
That they were not collectibles, that they were not specimens, but they were ancestors of people who are alive now.
Hello and welcome to the National NAGPRA program. My name is Stephen Simpson and I am a lawyer in the Division of Indian Affairs of the Interior Office of the Solicitor. In this video, we will be explaining what evidence is used to determine cultural affiliation by a museum or federal agency under NAGPRA, as well as how a decision is reached and what will occur when there is a dispute over a finding that is made. First, some basic NAGPRA background. Federal agencies and museums must comply with NAGPRA if they have possession or control over Native American cultural items, such as human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, a narrow group of items of historical importance. For purposes of NAGPRA, federal agencies do not include the Smithsonian. Museums under NAGPRA are any institution that receives federal funds and has possession of or control over cultural items subject to NAGPRA. This includes any institution run by a state, local, or tribal government, if that state, local, or tribal government receives federal funds. Federal agencies and museums work with federally recognized Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to determine cultural affiliation of Native American human remains and cultural items. It is important to note that the National NAGPRA program does not make determinations of cultural affiliation. This decision is left up to federal agencies and museums. The National NAGPRA program is a neutral in the decision-making process. Working with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations means consulting with them when making decisions in NAGPRA. Consultation is a very important part of NAGPRA and involves, at a minimum, letting the tribe or Native Hawaiian organization know what the museum or federal agency is proposing to do, listening to their comments, and responding to their comments. Consultation is required and especially important in the process of determining cultural affiliation. What is cultural affiliation? It is a relationship of shared group identity which can reasonably be traced historically or prehistorically between members of a present-day Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization and an identifiable earlier group. Thus, it is a cultural connection between human remains or items and present-day tribes, made based on a review of available facts.
Affiliation is not a difficult definition. It's about a shared group identity. What makes affiliation a difficult definition is who is telling the story. And when science is telling the story or archaeology is telling the story, it's a very limited story. And affiliation becomes one thing. But that's not what NAGPRA is about. NAGPRA is not about the archaeological story of affiliation. It's about using archaeology, anthropology, oral tradition, other expert opinion, linguistics, and any other kinds of evidence to tell the story. So you're not limited to an archaeological perspective on what affiliation means. But oral tradition has as much credibility as any other piece of evidence.
A determination of cultural affiliation is important in NAGPRA for several reasons. First, with regard to human remains, the federal agency or museum having possession of the remains will consult with tribes to make an initial decision of cultural affiliation. List that decision in the inventory of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects sent to the National NAGPRA program, and then publish a notice of the decision in the Federal Register. The notice publication of the decision triggers the ability of the tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations in the notice to request and then receive the ancestors and take control of their eventual disposition. As to claims received from tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations for unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony, the claimant will give a basis for cultural affiliation to be recognized by the museum or the federal agency. A notice of intent to repatriate is then the decision of the federal agency or museum to acknowledge the claim and transfer control to the claimant or claimants after 30 days from publication. When there are new finds on federal or Indian lands, a determination of cultural affiliation must be made by the landowner immediately so that prompt disposition can take place. In this situation, the decision is published twice in a newspaper. Publication in a newspaper or the Federal Register of the decision on cultural affiliation and then waiting 30 days to act to transfer control allows any disputing claimants to come forward. If they do, and the disputing claimant is a tribe or a Native Hawaiian organization, then the museum or federal agency must resolve that competing claim by deciding which claimant is the most appropriate. Since a showing of cultural affiliation is key in the initial NAGPRA repatriation process, it is important to understand how this works and how the law provides a system to resolve disputes. Decision-making in NAGPRA and a means to resolve disputes works this way. The museum or federal agency uses the information they have and the information gained in consultation with tribes to determine cultural affiliation of human remains, using a reasonable basis standard. This is not scientific certainty, but a reasonable determination that can be made from the facts. In other words, what do the facts show? In the case of claims made for cultural items by tribes, it is up to the tribe to begin the showing of cultural affiliation, using the same reasonable basis standard. The claim of a tribe actually has three parts: that the tribe or Native Hawaiian organization has the authority under NAGPRA to make a claim, that the item claimed falls into a NAGPRA category of unassociated funerary object, sacred object, or object of cultural patrimony, and that there is cultural affiliation between the tribe or Native Hawaiian organization and the item. If two or more tribes make a joint claim, there is no controversy. If there are multiple culturally affiliated tribes, but they agree among themselves to make a joint claim, or only one tribe comes forward, there is no controversy. But if two or more have competing claims, then the federal agency or museum must resolve the controversy by determining which is the most appropriate claimant. To do so, the law requires more than a reasonable basis for the determination. Rather, NAGPRA requires, in this case, a clear showing of cultural affiliation. Note that this is still not absolute or a scientific certainty. If the museum or federal agency makes a determination in the first instance that cultural affiliation of the Native American human remains cannot be determined using the reasonable basis standard, then the human remains are referred to as culturally unidentifiable. A tribe that disagrees with this decision can support a cultural affiliation determination with a preponderance of the evidence. In the law, preponderance of the evidence means more likely than not. So, in this context, a determination of "I don't know" cultural affiliation would be overcome with information to show the reasonable basis for a positive finding. The way the NAGPRA process works, the museum or federal agency has the first obligation to make a determination of cultural affiliation, and if they can't, then the tribe or Native Hawaiian organization can supply the information from which cultural affiliation can be determined. Hopefully, all this information would be shared in the act of consultation. Again, what is culturally unidentifiable? Native American human remains are considered to be culturally unidentifiable when a relationship of shared group identity cannot be reasonably traced historically or prehistorically between members of a present-day Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization and an identifiable earlier group. Now we'll see how those definitions play out in the NAGPRA process. Section 3 of the statute applies to the disposition of Native American human remains and cultural items removed from federal or tribal lands after November 16, 1990. If such remains or items may be found as part of an intentional excavation, the relevant federal agency must consult with appropriate tribes before the excavation to develop a plan for disposition. If such remains or items are inadvertently found during the course of other work, the federal agency must stop work and consult with appropriate tribes on a plan for disposition. Part of that plan is determining who has the priority for custody of the items. The first priority is to the lineal descendant. This is an unbroken chain of descendancy between the human remains and the claimant. Second on the list of priority is the Indian tribal landowner. Third on the list, if there are no lineal descendants or Indian tribal landowners, is the culturally affiliated Indian tribe. Lastly, if the federal agency has not found cultural affiliation, then the federal agency looks to the tribe that aboriginally occupied the area, unless there is an Indian tribe with a stronger cultural relationship to the human remains and cultural items. Before disposition can occur, the federal agency must publish a notice of intended disposition in a newspaper. The other part of NAGPRA that relates to cultural affiliation determinations is repatriations and dispositions from collections of federal agencies and museums. The sections of NAGPRA that deal with the collections process are sections 5 through 7. The determination of cultural affiliation for items and collections is initially done in conjunction with the inventory and summary process. Section 5 deals with inventories of Native American human remains and their associated funerary objects. An inventory is an item-by-item description of human remains and associated funerary objects that are culturally affiliated and/or culturally unidentifiable. This means the museum or federal agency might have one inventory of culturally affiliated remains and objects and another inventory listing culturally unidentifiable remains and objects, or they may have only an inventory of one kind of remains and objects. Section 6 deals with cultural items, such as funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, and is called a summary. The purpose of the summary is to provide information about the collections to lineal descendants and Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations that may wish to request repatriation of such objects. It includes an estimated number of objects, description of the kinds of objects, acquisition information, and information relevant to identifying lineal descendants or culturally affiliated tribes. Museum and federal agency officials must provide copies of the summary to lineal descendants when known, and to officials and traditional religious leaders representing Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations that are or are likely to be culturally affiliated with the cultural items. What goes on during the summary and inventory process? The museum or federal agency contacts potential lineal descendants and Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations that may be interested in the human remains or cultural items. During the formation of the inventory, the museum or federal agency consults with the lineal descendants, if any, and the potentially culturally affiliated Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations to find out if there is actually a cultural affiliation to the human remains or cultural items. Upon request by lineal descendants or Indian tribe officials, museum or federal agency officials must provide lineal descendants, Indian tribal officials, and traditional religious leaders with access to records, catalogs, relevant studies, or other pertinent data for the purpose of determining the geographic origin, cultural affiliation, and basic facts surrounding acquisition and accession of objects covered by the summary. Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and the National NAGPRA program get a copy of the summary once it is completed. Access to this information may be requested at any time and must be provided in a reasonable manner to be agreed upon by all parties.
It's appropriate to provide copies, those field notes. We ask for those copies of everything that the museum has and everything the federal agency may have when it concerns human remains or collections, cultural material, okay? And the reason we're asking for that is because there's something that NAGPRA doesn't talk about that we have to deal with. We have to rebury these individuals. And our culture is that we're not supposed to disturb our ancestors and their journey. And there's certain things that we do, traditionally, still today, when we bury our people. And that journey's been disrupted. So now, we have to repatriate our people, which we never thought we'd have to deal with, and bury them closest to where they come from.
In its inventory, a museum or federal agency must determine whether the human remains and associated funerary objects are clearly identifiable as to tribal origin. If not, the museum or federal agency must determine whether, given the totality of circumstances, the remains or objects are likely to be culturally affiliated with the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. The museum or federal agency sends a copy of the completed inventory, which is their determination of whether the human remains are culturally affiliated or culturally unidentifiable, to the tribes and National NAGPRA. Next, where cultural affiliation of Native American human remains and cultural items has not been established in the inventory or the summary by either being clearly identifiable or by a reasonable belief, then the museum or federal agency consults further with the relevant Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations to find out if cultural affiliation can be established under Section 7 of NAGPRA. This consultation applies whether the Native American human remains are not yet part of a completed culturally affiliated inventory, or if they have been determined to be culturally unidentifiable. In this situation, an Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization can show cultural affiliation by a preponderance of the evidence. This legal term means that based on the evidence before the museum or federal agency, the tribe or Native Hawaiian organization is more likely than not to be culturally affiliated. This is a lesser standard than a scientific certainty or beyond a reasonable doubt.
As an anthropologist and archaeologist, one of the most important things that I learned when I started working with NAGPRA some 12 years ago was that the cultural affiliation standard is a preponderance standard. And that's a much lower standard of evidence that most of us as archaeologists are used to or maybe even comfortable with. And so when you look at the different lines of evidence in the law, including oral traditions, that one must consider in making those determinations, the standard that we adhere to here is preponderance standard. More likely than not, we try to find all reasonable evidence that can be available. Those can be ethnographic accounts, archaeological evidence, physical anthropological evidence, and of course one of the most important lines of information is that information that we get from tribes themselves. So to do this, to determine cultural affiliation, one thing that we have done is really be proactive in seeking information from tribes that can help us to make those decisions, but also seeking other research avenues that can aid us in that effort.
Remember, as I said earlier, cultural affiliation is a relationship of shared group identity which can reasonably be traced, historically or prehistorically, between members of a present-day Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization and an identifiable earlier group. What is the evidence to show that relationship? Congress laid out in NAGPRA what types of evidence museums and federal agencies should look at. These are not listed in any specific order or in the amount of weight to be given to them. Assuming that the sources of the evidence are equally reliable, different types of evidence should be given equal weight. It is also not a checklist. A museum or federal agency does not need to meet all the lines of evidence to have preponderance. It could meet only one line and have enough to make a determination. Different museums, agencies, and tribes have their viewpoints on the types of evidence that are used. This is why consultation is so important in this process. The types of evidence that Congress said museums and federal agencies should weigh in determining cultural affiliation are geographical, kinship, biological, archaeological, anthropological, linguistic, folkloric, oral traditional, historical, and other relevant information or expert opinion. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but we will focus on a couple of them that are used the most often: anthropological and archaeological evidence and oral tradition. Museums and federal agencies often use anthropological and archaeological evidence and are very comfortable with that type of evidence. Many museums and federal agencies are uneasy with oral tradition, that they consider to be unproven and unscientific and therefore unreliable. Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, on the other hand, often have rich oral traditions surrounding their origins and sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony that are an integral part of their culture. Many Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations are uncomfortable with the emphasis that museums and federal agencies put on anthropological and archaeological evidence, based on a long history of concern that anthropologists and archaeologists gathered sensitive information without the consent of the tribes and then misinterpreted it or appropriated and misused important objects. Under NAGPRA, however, both anthropological and archaeological evidence and oral tradition are valid forms of evidence and should be accorded equal weight in a museum or federal agency's determination of cultural affiliation. Likewise, Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations should try, if possible, to present anthropological and archaeological information to the museum or federal agency to support the oral tradition evidence. None of this is to demean the value of any lines of evidence, or to say that any one line of evidence is more important than any other, but rather to emphasize that the museum or federal agency needs to consider the broadest possible range of available evidence, and that the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization needs to present its best possible case for cultural affiliation to the museum or federal agency consistent with its cultural values.
Oral history has always been a part of us. You know, in our way of life, oral history has been there since our creation. And you know that in our world, this was one of the things that the elders always used to tell us, and elders before that, that this is the only way that you're going to protect anything that's we call intellectual property, and that's our language, and that's our stories and everything else. And we didn't have a written language. We didn't have anything till lately, probably in the 80s. Then finally, you know, we started to get our language, our written and everything else. But before that, that was the only way that we protected a lot of these things.
There are some anthropologists, and then there are some American Indian groups who are trying to find ways to really integrate tribal traditions and cultures with archaeology to add strength to both. I think perhaps that might be the best way to do that, is to not try to rely on each one as separate, but try to interweave them and to add strength to each other in that regard.
There are several points in the NAGPRA process when a museum or federal agency may be making a determination of cultural affiliation, and each of them are accompanied by consultation. There's the consultation that a museum or federal agency has when they are creating their NAGPRA inventories and summaries that provide the basis for cultural affiliation. There are also continuing consultations that occur with tribes where there was not a clearly identifiable tribal origin or where there was not enough information before for the museum or federal agency to have a reasonable belief to make a cultural affiliation determination. Even if the museum or federal agency publishes a notice of inventory completion that claims that the human remains or cultural items are culturally affiliated to a particular tribe or are culturally unidentifiable, consultation should continue because another tribe could still bring forth subsequent information to change the affiliation based on the preponderance of the evidence.
When determining cultural affiliation, I encourage the museum to look at all the lines of evidence. There's the biological evidence. Most of the museum representatives are archaeologists that I work with. Some of them aren't, though, and they have no way of making a biological assessment, and so they rely totally on the tribal input and their museum records. And so they're using whatever evidence is available to them, and I do read the law that no additional research is required because that would have put a huge burden on museums to do additional research. So the available evidence, and that available evidence is oral tradition because you have consulted with the tribes. It's the histories, the songs, whatever the tribe has provided, that weighs as heavily as the museum documentation. And if you've had a physical anthropologist look at the remains, it just weighs as heavily as that evidence. No one piece of evidence is weighted heavier just because it's scientific or just because it's oral tradition.
Can a party to this process get help in presenting information or in making the cultural affiliation determination? Yes, from the NAGPRA Review Committee. The Review Committee is a neutral party with balance from both halves of the NAGPRA community. Under Section 8C3 of NAGPRA, at the request of any affected party, the Review Committee can make findings of fact concerning the identity or cultural affiliation of cultural items or the return of such items. The affected party will be asked to submit materials for the committee to review and will be asked to present the issue to the committee at one of its scheduled meetings. Other affected parties will be invited to submit additional materials beyond the inventory or summary and appear before the committee as well, but they do not have to do so. This process has not been used very much, but is available. Details concerning this process are available on the National NAGPRA Program website. So what happens if a museum or federal agency and an Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization disagree concerning cultural affiliation? Before anyone hauls another party into court, they should bring the dispute before the Review Committee. Under Section 8C4 of NAGPRA, the Review Committee is also responsible for facilitating the resolution of any disputes among Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, or lineal descendants, and federal agencies or museums relating to the return of human remains or cultural items. One of the parties to a dispute can ask the Review Committee to hear the case. The committee will take materials from both parties to review, and both parties can present their case to the committee at one of its scheduled meetings. The committee has the power to convene the parties to a dispute on its own. Usually, though, the committee will only hear a dispute if both parties agree to appear before the committee. While the findings of the Review Committee are not binding on the parties, they are important. The findings of the Review Committee have been used as expert opinion, which, as mentioned earlier, is one of the types of evidence that can be used in cultural affiliation. In addition, any records and findings made by the Review Committee may be admissible as evidence in any subsequent court action, and courts have required that parties re-examine their determinations when they have ignored findings of the Review Committee. In this video, I explained what cultural affiliation is, what evidence is used to determine cultural affiliation, and that consultation between federal agencies, museums, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations is an important part of decision-making in NAGPRA. Thank you.
I guess I want to say thank you to Congress for giving us NAGPRA. And I say it in a weird way, because I say it laughing like that, because there is criticism in Indian country of NAGPRA. But, and although I will sit here and tell you about the 123,000 sets of ancestral remains that haven't come home and this work that needs to be done, I can also tell you about, you know, the other sets of remains that have come home. And so, and setting this process into place.
I think it's humbled me a lot, because I had a lot of assumptions about what I thought I knew as an archaeologist and as a scientist and as a woman. And it has humbled me. I've been privileged to take part in events that I never would have imagined taking part in. And I've built some deep, lasting friendships, and it's really helped me to gain empathy for understanding belief systems that are not my own. And that's what's really, I think, important in a struggle with this, is that I've heard so many times people say, well, what's the big deal? If it were my grandmother, I wouldn't care. Well, the big deal is it's not your grandmother, it's someone else's grandmother, and they do care, you know? And so I think building empathy and cross-cultural understanding has been pretty pivotal for me.
The last reburial I did was January. We just got the remains back. It was from a disposition. And I was like, oh man, I don't want to have these hanging out in my office all winter, you know? So I got my snowshoes on and threw them on my back, you know, and I had the shovel, and I was like trekking through the woods, and it's like, I hope the ground's unfroze. If not, I'm gonna have to start a fire. But luckily I started digging and the ground was unfrozen. You know, it's just like cool, you know, you feel really good. You know, you're reburying, and the remains were all kids, you know, just like little itty bitty skulls and just little guys, you know, and they're from right down where I grew up in Mackinac City, which is like 20 miles from Cross Village. So this is like real personal. And it's like felt really good, you know, it's like I did something good today. You know, it's just like something I can be proud of. I call my mom and she's all happy and tell other people. I was like, oh, that's a good thing.